Thanks, Peg. So happy to be here. I had the honor of coming to read when my hardcover came out, and paperback has just come out, so I'm feeling very lucky to be reading in this beautiful space. I usually read from the beginning of the novel, but I've already done that here, so I thought in honor of our theme, the heart of the matter, and Valentine's coming up, I would read about romantic love. The book is about love, as much of literature is. It takes the form of a letter from a 40-year-old mother of three living in San Francisco to her son, who's been in a life-threatening car accident. And it moves back and forth in time between her present life, which is imploding, and this wild winter that she spent in Europe when she was 19. Not unlike the wild winter that I spent in Europe, except without all the plot stuff going on. So instead of reading what I usually read, which is part of the letter from Annie, our main character, to her son, I thought I would just read from this wild winter, and I would focus on the romantic love. And so the book has been described by reviewers as having various love triangles. It's also been described as having a love rhombus. I'll let you guys decide after you read it, hopefully if you read it, which of those you agree with. So I was thinking, well, I'll pick out a couple of love scenes to read, but I realized actually there's sex scenes. Two of them are sex scenes, but they're very short. I just wrote an essay recently about writing sex scenes when you're the mother of teenagers. I have 3 teenagers, and I have a 12-year-old. And what's interesting is that they don't read the stuff I've written, so it's sort of freeing in a way. Bustle, but even if they did, I'm afraid of what they might think of my view of sex is. One reviewer in Bustle, I'm just going to read you what she said about the sex scenes, that they were decidedly unerotic, even uncomfortable or cringeworthy. So prepare yourselves. And she said that they're to intrigue, not titillate. The narrator gets involved with 3 different men when she's young, and I'm going to read a bit from each of those entanglements. But I've taken out the names so that to protect the innocent. No, actually, not so as not to give away the plot, because this is the sort of book that if you visit from the middle of the book, and if you know who the characters are, it's not going to be as interesting. But I will say that the one kind of represents sort of unrequited love, and then there's the unwanted love, and then there's, I guess, what we are all kind of hoping for, what we're hoping our kids will find, which is the right kind of love. And I'm not going to tell you which is which, and there won't be a quiz or anything. So I'll just begin. So we walked. I was not comfortable walking beside him, but he was clearly at ease. Oh, and I should say that the first scene is set in London, and the second one is in Paris, and the third one is on a boat on the way to Ireland, which is out of the 3 settings for that part of the book. So we walked. I was not comfortable walking beside him, but he was clearly at ease. He hummed. He pointed out the sights, Trafalgar Square, a church whose name I've forgotten, the embankment and the Thames. It was dusk. Lavenders and pinks had drained from the sky and collected in the fat clouds, casting their mirror image on the surface of the river. There was a fiery line at the horizon, and the trees were shivering with water from the afternoon rain. I snatched a look at him now and then. He had a narrow face and a broad nose and big ears and curly hair that was almost black. He had a way of talking, a way of walking, his arms swinging, his camera slung over his shoulder, that always made me feel he was headed toward fun. We turned away from the river and came to a pub. We sat down to drink. Time and inhibition fell away. He told me he'd noticed me as soon as I'd arrived at the party the night before. He told me he could almost see the heat coming off me, the sparks. He put his hand on my knee and we drank until the pub closed. I don't remember the journey to Victoria House. I do remember he held my hand and we climbed the stairs to my blue room. We lay down on the bed. I told him I was not on the pill. He pulled a condom from his wallet. The long-awaited event, the loss of my virginity, finally transpired. What did I think of it that first time? I was swept up, if not physiologically, then at least romantically. I was, if not adventurous, at least pliable, and as far as I could tell, he was not disappointed. I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of rain hitting the window. He was asleep, turned away from me, half covered by the sheet. His clothing was tossed upon the floor: jeans, shirt, blazer, belt, boots, stylish clothes that made an impression even discarded about my utilitarian room. His back was pale and smooth, and I wanted to touch it, but I resisted. Already I sensed that to claim him, to take something of him without asking, would be to drive him away. And we're moving to Paris, and this is someone new. I reached my hand toward him. I meant nothing by it, but of course he took meaning from it. He pressed his lips to my hand. He bent over me and kissed my forehead, then my lips. His lips on mine felt too light, too tender, too tentative, and the kiss brought back the abject failure of the first night. I tried to turn my face away from him, but he surprised me. He took my chin in his hand and kissed me harder. He pulled away and looked me in the eye, and I was aroused in spite of myself. He got under the covers in his pajamas. I did not look at him. I did not touch him. I did not do anything at all. He put his hand beneath my sweater and began to kiss me vehemently. Then there were footsteps and the sound of the elevator opening and closing, then only the sound of the storm. There was a flash of lightning, a roll of thunder, the hammering rain. The sheets, I remember, were white satin. His hands moved over my body. He undressed me, then undressed himself. He rolled over on top of me. I became a great internal shrug. All my organs gave way to the path of least resistance. I felt myself dislocating, but the dislocation did not have the expected result. Instead of removing me, it made me more present, more available, more pliable, more attuned. He entered me, and at some point the universe tilted and an unaccountable shift occurred. Something like abandonment overtook me. It was like the curtain that dropped when I was drinking, but even more absolute in its obliteration of worry and pain, its obliteration of everything. I gave myself over to the whims of my own body. I ceased to be who I had been, and I was swept up, out of shame and into pleasure. He had achieved this on the first try, or else I achieved it myself by not caring, by letting desire rule the day. Is desire the right word? It was more like hunger, rumbling in a specific location in my body until it was sated. I love you, he said afterward. I love you more than you can possibly imagine. He was still touching me, but too delicately now that it was over. He ran the tips of his fingers along my arm so lightly it was as if he were afraid he would leave a scar, and it was all I could do, not to swat his hand away. He was breathing heavily, and I had an urge to put my hand over his mouth to make the sound stop. Shame was reinstated. What was it that shamed me? It was my tacit consent. It was the success of the thing, followed by the return of my distaste. I had received something I had not asked for. I had taken it on a whim, and because I'd taken it, I was at liberty to throw it away. I had not cared, and so I had come. I had been set down in the earth, and so I was loved. Now we're moving to a ferry that's crossing from France to Ireland. This is the same storm, it's the end of the storm. I studied his, and they're on the deck, kind of in the middle of the storm, and this is somebody new. I studied his profile briefly, trying to decide if he was handsome or not. His eyes were striking, but it was hard to tell about the rest of his face because of the hat and the beard. He caught me looking at him. Before I could decide if this was a good or a bad thing, he stepped behind me and gathered my hair in his hands and pulled it back off my face. England's that way, he said. Ireland's this way. We're headed straight toward Ireland's eye. He was using my hair as a lever, holding it firmly, turning me gently. The sky was dense with cloud, but for a moment there was a parting, and a final gasp of sunlight appeared, edging the clouds in silver and giving the misty rain the appearance of slow-falling snow. His hands were cool and dry on my neck, and his body was grazing my back. He was talking to me, telling me about where he planned to travel next. I felt the words moving in his chest and exiting near my ear, and I felt him let my hair fall through his hands, then gather it up again, smoothing it firmly off my neck and back from my forehead. His hands seemed to capture the whole of my head, calming it, unsettling it, but exciting it too. How was all that possible? It seemed important to know how long we would be allowed to stand this way. 2 minutes? 10? And how would I know when those minutes had passed? It would not be possible to keep track of something as unimaginative as time while I stood with him this way, understanding, finally, about love. understanding the impulse toward acts of bravery and abandon, devotion and sacrifice. It was not a matter of concentrated effort. It was not a carefully orchestrated pursuit. It was not selfish oblivion either. It was not that fleeting suspension of thought, of everyday neuroses, followed by their sudden reinstatement, along with new burdens, new obligations. It was a tender, certain longing, not to press forward, but to remain in his embrace, to resist a shift in the wind or in the position of his hands on my skin, his lips beside my ear, the hard pressure of his chest against my spine, to hold tight inside the cradle of meaning that was his body behind me, before the sun was swallowed up by the wet horizon. It was a moment that brought on a more or less shift in my notion of the future, a more or less permanent shift in my notion of the future. But if he could do this with his hands, if he could form words, if he was conscious and coherent enough to speak and move, then he must also be capable of letting my hair down and stepping away. That would be the very worst thing, if he were to end this before I did. I could not let it happen. I would have to stop it. I would have to be the one to step away. But I couldn't. I didn't. I stayed there in his arms.